A small mountain town is shaken by a series of brutal murders, each more savage than the last. As fear spreads, rumors of a werewolf grow. Officer John Marshall, battling his own demons, is determined to prove there's a human behind the killings. But as the bodies pile up, even he begins to question, what if the legend is real? PJ and Brienne arrive at a rented cabin in a quiet, snow-covered town. That evening, while having dinner at a local diner, PJ gets into an argument with some locals after they make a homophobic remark. It's hinted that his brother is gay, and he later apologizes to Brienne for causing a scene. Back at the cabin, as Brienne looks for the hot tub heater, it's revealed that PJ is planning to propose. After relaxing in the hot tub, PJ goes inside to shower while Brienne stays back to turn it off. She suddenly hears a growling sound, and inside, PJ notices multiple dogs barking outside. When he checks, he finds Brienne's mutilated, lifeless body lying in the snow. The next day, we meet our main character, John, who is a police officer in Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. During his speech, we learn a lot about him. He has anger issues, an ex-wife he doesn't get along with, a daughter, and he's been sober for 3 years. While speaking, he notices the unusual silence upstairs, a sign that something is wrong. We then cut to John arriving at the crime scene of Brienne's murder, where he meets his father, Sheriff Hadley, and Officer Julia Robson. The medical examiner informs the sheriff that the killer gruesomely removed parts of Brienne's body. It quickly becomes clear that Hadley is unprepared for a case, as violent crimes like this are rare in their small town. Rumors start spreading fast, with a frantic neighbor asking Officer if there was a chemical spill. Meanwhile, the owner of the rental cabin is more concerned about the police investigation than the fact that someone was murdered on his property. Soon after, a reporter interviews Sheriff and John, making it clear that panic is starting to take hold of the town. Afterward, we learn that the sheriff is nearing retirement and dealing with heart problems. At the diner, we meet the rest of John's team as they go over the details of Brienne's murder. Sitting together are Officer Gutierrez, Officer Bo, Officer Chavez, and Officer John Marshall, all trying to make sense of what happened that night. The next day, John meets his ex-wife, Brittany, and their daughter, Jenna, at the diner, but Brittany quickly gets on his nerves. Meanwhile, flashbacks show events from the previous day and night. A snowboard instructor plans to meet her ex-boyfriend, Josh, but is suddenly attacked by a werewolf. She tries to escape, but the creature tears off her arm and kills her. The scene then cuts back to the present, where John is informed of her murder. At the crime scene, it's revealed that the killer took the victim's head. John once again argues with Gutierrez, insisting that this is not the work of a werewolf. However, Bo blurts out in front of the press that it might have been a wolf. John pulls Bo aside to talk, but tensions boil over, and he attacks him, leading to a fight. The next morning, John coldly fires Bo, sarcastically telling him to get a job at WikiLeaks. He then gets into an argument with Chavez, once again insisting that the killer is not a werewolf because they don't exist. During a team meeting, Julia shares the medical examiner's findings, revealing that the snowboarder's body was covered in canine-like bite marks. However, the attacker, estimated to be the size of a bear, left no saliva or DNA behind. The next day, on the way to the city to visit PJ, Julia and John discuss John's frustration with the FBI for refusing to help. Suddenly, someone throws a beer bottle at their car, but when they stop to check, no one is around. We then cut to a random scene of a guy doing drugs in a trailer with a wolf lurking outside. When John and Julia arrive at PJ's place, they try to question him about the night of the murder, but he loses his temper, furious that they haven't caught the killer yet. Julia offers him and Brienne's belongings left at the cabin, but PJ breaks down, leaving his mother to take them instead. The both then leaves the house. The next day, at a diner, a local woman named Liz is having a meal with her daughter when a mysterious man approaches her. He asks unsettling personal questions. Feeling uneasy, Liz excuses herself and quietly asks the waitress to call the police. Before help arrives, the man slips away, but Liz later tells John and Julia that she's convinced he was the killer. That night, Liz is driving with her daughter when she spots a dead deer in the middle of the road. She stops to investigate, bringing a gun with her. As she looks behind, she sees Werewolf near the car. She shoots it, but it's not work. She tries to run, but Werewolf catches and brutally kills her and daughter. The next day, as her dead body brings to examine, John angrily confronts the coroner, who is unable to find any evidence on Liz's body. The coroner, frustrated by the lack of suspects, fires back at John, and the two ends up in a physical fight. We then see glimpses of John at Liz and her daughter's funeral, showing the emotional toll the case is taking on him. The next day, we see the drug user from the trailer burning a body. As the camera pulls back, we notice a wolf tattoo on his arm, hinting at a possible connection to the murders. Meanwhile, John, seemingly starting to believe in the werewolf theory, heads to the library to do some research. Later, John and Julia investigate a strange message left on Liz's work phone. Tracing the call leads them to a payphone, but there are no fingerprints to work with. That night, the police prepare for another possible attack. Hadley gathers the officers and gives a speech before they head out on patrol. But John notices his father clutching his chest, clearly in pain. Once the others leave, John convinces Hadley to go to the hospital and retire. John assures his dad that he will catch the killer and tells receptionist officer to call an ambulance for his dad, and leaves for patrol. Meanwhile, Jenna ignores the town's curfew and sneaks out to meet her boyfriend, Brock. The two are making out in his truck when Brock notices a neighbor trying to get their attention from her window. Jenna quickly realizes the woman is warning them, just as the werewolf slams into the truck. Panicked, Brock bolts, causing Jenna to fall backward onto the ground. The police receive the emergency call and rush to the scene, with John arriving first. He gets there just in time to stop the attack and chases after the werewolf with a shotgun. But he halts when he hears Jenna calling for him. Seeing her there, John is stunned and immediately erupts in anger, scolding her for breaking curfew. Jenna soon realizes she's bleeding from the back of her head due to the fall and grows furious that John doesn't even ask if she's okay. Frustrated, she curses him out and declares she can't wait to leave for college in a few weeks so she won't have to deal with him anymore. Then, she orders him to take her to the hospital and climbs into his car. As she's ranting, Officer Gutierrez's voice crackles over the radio, reporting that he's in pursuit of the werewolf. Gunshots ring out at the end of the block, but John, torn between duty and his daughter's safety, chooses to drive Jenna to the hospital. Minutes later, Julia and the other officers arrive at the scene, only to discover Officer Gutierrez's body gruesomely stuffed inside a garbage can. At the hospital, John secretly grabs Jenna's phone to find Brock's address, then breaks into his house and attacks him. Brock's mom panics and pepper sprays John, but when she realizes who he is, she immediately turns on her son, demanding to know what he did. John then heads back to the hospital and hears that his father has passed away. That night, Jenna returns home to find John wasted after crashing his car. She helps him to his room as he finally breaks down, admitting he failed to catch the killer despite promising his dad he would. Meanwhile, the man with the wolf tattoo is at his trailer, taking drugs until he overdoses. The next morning, Julia wakes John with big news. They caught the guy. Rushing outside, John sees EMTs wheeling in a stretcher, the dead wolf tattoo guy. The coroner informs John and Julia that the dead man had an exotic knife collection and lived just half a mile from the first murder. He also reveals that the woman the man was burning earlier was Helena Gaines. Coroner also points out that they search his house, but can't find his wolf suit. After wrapping up the case, John drops off the victims and suspects' belongings before heading to Paul's house. Paul, the owner of the house PJ and Brian rented, had shown up earlier when the police were investigating. He's the guy who asked to speak to his wife. Paul welcomes John inside for coffee and casually asks about the case now that it's closed. He even offers to spike the coffee, which John happily accepts. As John notices all the alcohol on the counter, he jokes about Paul's wife being away for the weekend. That's when Paul nonchalantly replies that he's not married. John doesn't catch the lie at first, but then Paul asks about Jenna. Something shifts in John's mind. No one outside the police should have known she was involved in the attack. He thanks Paul for the coffee and leaves. As he steps outside, he decides to go inside again and asks Paul to stand up straight, and Paul is revealed to be around 7 feet tall. Realizing that John has figured out the truth, Paul suddenly slams the door shut and bolts. John quickly calls for backup, but there's no response. With no other option, he smashes through a window and enters the house. As he searches, he stumbles upon a snowboarder's severed head. Before he can react, Paul ambushes him, driving a knife into his stomach. Hearing sirens approaching, Paul makes a run for it through the back door. John, despite his wound, struggles to his feet, grabs his gun, and chases after him. But before he can get a shot off, Paul, now dressed in a full werewolf costume, knocks him to the ground. The chase continues into the woods behind Paul's house, where Paul attacks John again, easily overpowering him. Just as it seems like the fight is over, fireworks suddenly explode in the distance, momentarily distracting Paul. That's when Julia arrives, firing her gun and dropping him to the ground. John pulls himself up and, without hesitation, empties his gun into Paul's head. As Paul finally dies, John collapses from his injuries, and Julia rushes to his side. A few weeks later, Julia helps Jenna move into her new dorm, and we see that she has officially taken over as sheriff. After Julia leaves, John arrives and awkwardly tells Jenna that he loves her, and she, despite their rocky relationship, says it back. Before heading out, John mentions that he left her some protection in her top drawer, which immediately disgusts Jenna. Once he's gone, she hesitantly checks the drawer, expecting the worst. She finds a box of condoms, but then notices something else tucked away, something that leaves her completely surprised. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more interesting movie recaps.